It's my privilege this morning to introduce to you my brother, John Kriegelstein. I've known him for a little bit. One of the things that strikes me most about him, he is passionate for the love of God. Jeannie could not be here. He is the Mid-America Director of Education for the Union. Jeannie could not be with you, would fall in love with her just as much as you will fall in love with John this morning. John has 3 adult children, and he's beat me because he has 6 grandchildren. And it's his desire and hope that all 6 of his grandchildren gets a Seventh-day Adventist Christian education. Please pray with me and pray for our guest speaker and listen to what the Holy Spirit has on his heart. Thank you.
Thank you, Odie. I am indeed passionate about Adventist education, having been a product of that myself. I grew up in upstate New York, attended Union Springs Academy. I only lived 5 miles from the school, so I was a village kid. And my mom, next weekend, is going to be going back to attend her 70th alumni weekend. And she's unable to travel by herself anymore, so I'm going to Medford, Oregon to pick her up, to take her to New York, and then to bring her back. And it's going to be kind of one of those dream trips for her. She lived in that area for so long, and just last summer we sold her home back there. And, you know, it's fun to be part of the Adventist system because her wish was that someone would buy her house that would have a passion for God. And it just turned out, certainly not arranged by us, that the son of the maintenance director for Union Springs Academy bought her house. And her thrill is that, oh, I'm so glad it's still God's house. Odie mentioned my wife, Jeannie. We have had one incredible ride, so to speak, working within the church. And it's amazing how fast the years go. I started working for the church 39 years ago and have never regretted a moment of it. Took 1 year off and attended a public university, but other than that, all of my experience has been within Adventist education. So it's not surprising this morning that I would talk to you a bit about education. But hopefully it will be within a little different context than maybe you have seen it before. A couple years ago, a good friend of mine, a fellow director of education for the Lake Union, shared a piece that he had written in which he presented a story in a way that totally opened my eyes. I never thought of this story in the same way, in this way before. But you'll remember the story pretty quickly here. In Uncle Arthur's book, his Bible Stories, Volume 2, there's the reference to them coming out of Egypt, and Moses is leading the Israelites out of Egypt. They come to the Red Sea, they're trapped. And you notice I put trapped in parentheses, because were they really trapped? With God, there is no traps. And yet they cross through on dry ground. There is a picture in those books of them crossing through, you might say, the valley of dry ground through the Red Sea with the walls of water on each side. And there are 2 boys in that picture. What are they doing? Do you remember? I heard it. Every time I ask that question, there's people in the audience that know the exact picture that I'm talking about. You've seen that picture. There are the boys throwing rocks into that water, and I've often wondered, what would have happened if you'd gone up and stuck your arm into that wall? Would the surface tension have broken and the water come in? No, I don't think so. Would your hand have come out wet? All kinds of questions you could ask that really don't matter for anything other than just interesting to think about. But if you look at the faces of those two boys, what do you see? They don't seem to have a care in the world, do they? But if you look at the faces of the adults, the one man with a stick raised driving the animals, do you see that same carefree attitude? No, not really. And if you think about what they have just come through, even though all of a sudden their hearts are bursting with gratitude, at the same time they're humans, they're fearful for what might come. Will they get through in time? Will the Egyptians come charging right on in with them? I don't know what all the thoughts were, but it's the background to this that was new to me. You remember the story? Moses goes to Pharaoh. But first of all, if you back up even further, did Moses want this job? No. Moses did everything he could to get out of that job. But when he goes, empowered by God, and it's interesting, God doesn't, in my opinion, in my experience, God never gave me the words I needed until I needed them. He didn't give me courage until I needed it. I can't drum up courage now and feel good about something tough that's coming. But when the time comes and I'm going through it, there are many times I've gone to some difficult board meetings and all I could do was say, Lord, I don't have a single clue what to do in this scenario. All I can do is put this foot forward and speak what you gave me then and do it again and again. And when I look back, it's like, where did that come from? Moses was in the same experience. He goes to Pharaoh. And if Pharaoh had known who Moses was, do you think he would have tried to kill him on the spot? I don't know, maybe Pharaoh did know who Moses was. But nonetheless, he had the power of God with him. And he said to Pharaoh, let my people go. And Pharaoh, after the water was turned to blood, said no. And it happens again after the frogs. Every place, he said no. After the gnats, no. Flies, no. The livestock die, no. The boils all over the Egyptians, still no from Pharaoh. Finally, hail destroys the crops, and Pharaoh starts to get it. At this point, he says, okay, you can take the men and the animals you need for your worship and go out into the wilderness. And what does Moses say now? No. Because Moses and Aaron, when they came back in, and Pharaoh said that, Moses' answer was that we will go with whom? With our young and our old, with our sons and with our daughters, and with our flocks and our herds, because we are to celebrate the festival to the Lord. Who was Moses refusing to go without? His children. I had never made that connection in the story before. Moses refused to leave Egypt. He refused to do anything without taking his children with him. The hail destroys the crops, and he almost gets it, but Pharaoh still hardens his heart and says no. The locusts come, Pharaoh still says no. The debilitating darkness over the land, Pharaoh still says no. And then finally, the firstborn offspring die, and Pharaoh at this point said, "Go! Get out of here." Moses was firm. He was consistent. He said, "We will go and we will take our children with us." And when Pharaoh said, "Just take the men," Moses says, "We will go and we will take our children with us." And when Pharaoh said, "Oh, just go out a little ways," Moses again said, "No, we are going to do this all or nothing, and we are going to take our children with us." God's message for us today, I think, is awake to the realities of the world situation. You don't have to read much on the news, but you become scared to death. Sometimes I think it's best not to know all the news. Number 2, separate ourselves from the alluring world. Come out of her, my people, so that you will not share in her sins, so that you will not receive any of her plagues. And I believe the third part of the message is God doesn't say save yourself. He says take your children with you. How do we do this? Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength. These commandments that I gave you today are to be on your hearts. And we heard this once before this morning. Impress them on your children. Talk about them when you sit at home and when you walk along the road, when you lie down and when you get up. Tie them as symbols on your hands and bind them on your foreheads. Write them on the door frames of your houses and on your gates. What part of life was left out of that picture? There isn't a part of life in which we're to be passing these things on to our children. All part of the process of taking our children with us. 6 practical suggestions. You could probably make this 8, 10, and then if it gets too many, it's no longer practical maybe, but here's 6 possible suggestions. Spend quality and quantity time with Christ each day. It's pretty hard to pass on to somebody else what you don't have yourself. And there's only one way to get it. And there's not one of us that doesn't have distractions that would prevent us from doing this if we let it. I am the vine, you are the branches, Jesus says. If a man remains in me and I in him, he will bear much fruit. Apart from me, you can do nothing. And we say that, and yet how many times do we try to run on our weak batteries rather than on a continually connection with God? You know, I speak to myself when I say some of these things. Number 2 in the practical suggestion list is to talk with our kids about our personal spiritual journey. This is kind of interesting. Value Genesis a few years ago, Value Genesis is that study that started in 1990, was repeated in 2000, was repeated in 2010. So we get these 3 snapshots of, you might say, spiritual values of our young people in our schools across the division. One of the things that comes out of that study very clearly is that we talk about our religion, our faith. Actually, we talk more about our religion than we do our faith. We talk about what we should do and what we shouldn't do, but we rarely spend much time talking to our kids about our own personal spiritual journey. They observe us, and for some reason they catch on and pass on to the next generation. What's happening inside of me spiritually is not something I share. I've gotten when I've gotten old that I'm quite willing to share that. But did I when my kids were such impressionable ages? Not as much as I wish. It's interesting, there's a book written, How to Help Your Child Really Love Jesus, written by Donna Hobenick. She has been, I believe she may be retired, but professor of educational and counseling psychology at Andrews University. How many of you have seen this book? There's a few of you, good. She has some pretty profound things that she says in there. One of the things, during the first 3 to 4 years, young children are much more feeling than thinking creatures. Does that surprise you? No. Feelings are always front and center for them. They experience life through their emotions. Just be around one for a few minutes and you'll understand that, don't you? I don't like this. Such feelings develop into attitudes. Attitudes toward God, toward prayer, towards worship, and towards church. Young children sense our own feelings and attitudes and catch religion from the home and the church. What is my attitude towards things that I just casually mention in the confines of my home? Things that maybe I would never say outside of the home. And yet, what am I teaching the young person in my home by those attitudes? When you look forward to going to church and joyfully participate in the services, your child will sense your joy and feel happy too. What a powerful mode of teaching that I'm afraid many of us never pay much attention to. You know, it's interesting because we all know these things are true, because we all the time reference so-and-so. Well, they're from, and I'll just use the Smith family. And it's like, oh, we know the attitudes of the Smith family, and these kids have the same attitude. Surprise. Good or bad, by the way. Practical step number 3, teach them how to pray and how to listen for the promptings of the Holy Spirit. When's the last time you consciously thought about teaching your kid how to understand when the Holy Spirit is prompting them? I have to be honest and say I don't remember a time where I sat out and said, Jason, I need you to understand how the Holy Spirit was working just now. And yet what a powerful lesson that is. Here's some interesting quotes. This is taken from Education. I think it's Education. It says at the end, maybe it's Adventist Home. But anyway, it's Ellen White. As soon as the little ones are intelligent to understand, how little is that? I'm hungry. This body feeds me. They're understanding. As soon as the little ones are intelligent to understand, parents should tell them the story of Jesus, that they may drink in the precious truth concerning the babe of Bethlehem. Is a mother nursing her child too early to start telling that story? I don't think so. And I'll show you why I say that in a few minutes. Impress upon the children's minds sentiments of simple spirituality that are adapted to their years and ability. My mom grew up, like I said, in upstate New York, and back in the late 50s, early 60s, or throughout the 60s, there would be these waves of offshoot movements that would move through our New York conference, it seemed like. And we would occasionally have some professor from Andrews University come out to our church, and they would expound about the problems one way or the other on some of these things. And my mom used to go home shaking her head, saying, I don't know about all that stuff, but I know Jesus says, if it's simple to understand, just speak it in the very simple words, and that's good enough for me. And that's what it's talking about here. Do it in the simple words that they can understand. They can understand Jesus' love. Anyway, bring your children in prayer to Jesus, for he has made it possible for them to learn religion as they learn to frame the words of the language. When do we start teaching them biblical truth? At the same time they're learning mama and dada. There it is. At the same time as they're developing speech, they should be learning the stories of the Bible. When I was young, we had our first child, and somebody had suggested, we saw this ad for all these cute little Disney stories, you know, the little simple fairy tales that are so innocent. And they all came in these nice little 45 size, but they were 33. They had the small hole in the middle records. And we got this simple little record player and started playing those things. And all of a sudden one day we thought, what are we doing? And we turned that around, got rid of those things, actually kept them around for quite a while, but the kids didn't want them. They wanted the Bible stories and had gotten the Bible stories in the various form. You know, the My Bible Friends book. In fact, when we were in Alaska, which is where I first met Odie, but this was before, we were there twice. So back in the 70s, we had a student who, at our school, our junior academy. Actually, now he's a professor of engineering at Walla Walla University. But we would pick him up. He was from a non-Adventist home. He'd become an Adventist. We'd pick him up every Sabbath, take him to church, and in the afternoon he didn't want to go home, so he'd just hang out at our house. He had My Bible Friends memorized because he was reading them to our kid while my wife and I took naps. But those are the stories that still stick in my kids' heads. I can't say it's perfect, but I never had seen that statement either, that when the kids are framing the words to their language is when we should be putting into them the truths that are so precious to us. Number 4 in this list of 6, find ways every day to remind our kids of who they are and what they're here for. Who are our kids? They're your sons and daughters, yeah. But they're a child of God. And they're that maybe almost more than anything else. And do we help them realize that? And another thing, what are they here for? Had a person, don't even remember his position now, he was at the union office in the North Pacific one time, and he gave us a little devotional. And in that devotional, he made the statement, every one of us is either a missionary or we're part of the mission field. There is nothing in between. What are our kids here for? Ultimately, to be representatives and to share the good news of Jesus to the other. Number 5, love our kids unconditionally. Can't say enough about that. I have to tell you that I was principal of an academy and had a son banned from the campus. I've had 2 kids get kicked out of college. I love them. They're church members. Yes, they are. And they love Jesus. One of them got kicked out for grades. Went on and now is actually going to be doing some teaching at Kettering this next year. But, you know, the other one is still trying to figure out exactly where life goes and has taken a lot of detours along the way, but is solidly in love with Jesus. And involve them in meaningful outreach projects. What you do to one of the least of these, you do it to me. I was listening to the Sabbath school discussion this morning about, you know, what do we do? There's so much fraudulent use by public of help services that are available. Does that mean we don't become involved in those? Because after all, we're just enabling somebody. Difficult questions, ones that I'm not going to sit here and try to answer. But interesting questions. But Jesus says, what you do to one of the least of these, you do to me. How do we help our kids do that? I think the mission trips that go on across this nation, both at home and abroad, are huge. And I tell you, I have a personal bias. I love mission trips that get involved not just in building something or cleaning up something, though those are wonderful experiences for kids. But I like it when the kids also have to learn to rub shoulders with who it is they're serving and to present a testimony to them, whether it's evangelistic series, whatever it is. I love it when the two are combined. It's amazing some of the stories that come back, and Dakota has had some of those, some wonderful experiences. In the days, this is an interesting statement, in the days of Christ, the town or city that did not provide for the religious instruction of the young was regarded as under the curse of God. Now, it doesn't say they had church schools. I recognize that's not what it says. It says provide for the religious instruction. And how do we do that? There are a multitude of ways that we do it. But I think we need to be very careful to recognize the importance of that. Seventh-day Adventists have been called to give our kids something better from education. Something better is the watchword of education. Let the students be directed to something better than display, ambition, or self-indulgence. Lead them to behold the one altogether lovely. When once the gaze is fixed upon him, the life finds its center and its focus. The enthusiasm, the generous devotion, the passionate ardor of the youth find here their true object. I had the privilege of working with an academy that was doing a public event in a city park. And it was basically a music conference, music concert open to the community. People were coming. And there was an elderly lady that came up to me, knowing that I was the principal of the academy, and said to me, man, these young people, they just bemoaning the young people in the Adventist schools of today. And I turned to her and I said, ma'am, I'm not sure who you're talking about, because the ones I work with are about ready to push us out of the way and get the work done. And I believe that. Yes, we can hold up some fingers of some that may be detractors, but that's not the general population. Our kids are on fire for God and they want to see Him come. Duty becomes a delight and sacrifice a pleasure. To honor Christ, to become like Him, to work for Him is the life's highest ambition and its greatest joy. In today's culture, much of what used to be part of the family has now been relegated to our schools. Public, private, parochial, for-profit, you name it. But most of us as parents are both working. We don't have the home environment all day long to provide the structure for our kids, and we've relegated that responsibility to schools. And I'm not here to say that's right or wrong. And if you can provide that very positive kind of homeschool environment, I'm not opposed to that, if that's what God has called you to do. But I do think it's important that we make good choices. Adventist education, if it's going to be Adventist education, and I'm going to poke at Odie just a minute here, because I have a pet peeve, and he used it this morning. He mentioned Christian education. And we all know what he means, and I take it in the light of the way he meant it. What he meant was Adventist Christian education. Because we can get Christian education down the street. And just like the man that sat in my office a few years ago, bemoaning the fact that had he known that his son could not have played at a certain level of basketball because he stayed in the Adventist Academy and was crying that we didn't do something about allowing him to play at that level, he said, had I known that, I would have taken him out of the academy and put him down the street in the Lutheran school. Maybe that's not all bad, but it's scary to me because what he was saying is it's more important that my kid, let me turn that around. It's less important that my kid grow up to be an Adventist than it is to just grow up and be a good Christian. There are many of us in the world today, in our culture, even within the Adventist church, that say, you know, there are so many bad things that go on in such and such Adventist school that I'm willing to put my kid and think they'll be better off if I put them in another Christian school. And what they're saying is what they teach them, and if they leave the church, that's fine, but they'll be good Christian people, and God will accept that. And I'm not going to go whether God will accept, because God accepts and knows the heart. I don't. But I think it's a dangerous move. But Adventist education must be thoroughly Adventist. I think there's times when in our Adventist system, pointing fingers within, we have said, oh, this is good enough and it will attract the people and we need to get them in our schools. And we have compromised sometimes things that are basic principles of our church in order to draw them in. And I think we have to be careful that Adventist education is thoroughly Adventist, and secondly, that it's fully committed to excellence. What does thoroughly Adventist mean? True education means more than the pursuit of certain course of study. It means more than a preparation for life that now is. It has to do with the whole being and with the whole period of existence possible to man. What is the whole period of existence possible to man? It's basically, in our thinking, birth through eternity. In the highest sense, the work of education and the work of redemption are one. For in education, as in redemption, other foundation can no man lay than that is laid, which is Jesus Christ. So what is a worldview, and why is that important? Because if our Adventist education system is going to be thoroughly Adventist, then there should be no room for anything that doesn't support and point to Adventist principles that's part of our education system. A worldview serves as a conceptual tool or a framework for perceiving and interpreting reality, which in turn informs the philosophy, the mission or vision, and the goals of an organization. So why a worldview? According to Kiner, our students need a conceptual framework that ties everything together, enabling them to understand themselves, their world, and their place in it. Kids today are looking for anchor points. I think they always were, but I think we're more aware of it now. They're looking for those things that tie them to something substantial. They need to have a framework. They need to understand that an education system is a whole, not as separate, discrete pieces, and to see how they all fit together. What is an Adventist worldview? An Adventist worldview accepts the Bible as the standard by which everything else is measured. Key concepts of Adventist worldview, there are 4. Creation, which is what is God's intention. The fall, how has God's purpose been distorted? Redemption, how does God help us to respond? And finally, recreation, how can we be restored in the image of God? That is part of the Adventist worldview. If you want to see it graphically, it would look like this. And a graphic has been designed for our NAD education system, with this, and it's going to tie through several other things. I'm going to move on to a little bit, you'll see that again in just a minute, but what does thoroughly Adventist mean? The Adventist world permeated across the curriculum, in all courses or classes, and this is where I struggle with, well, it doesn't matter if I go down the street and take another class, or I even struggle, go on record saying this, of us using at our academies courses from non-Adventist entities that are piped in through distance ed or something else, unless we can find a way to be very careful to make sure that the Adventist piece is brought in with it. And in all grades. There's no grade exempt from this. Putting the A in Adventist education means ensuring that it is thoroughly Adventist and fully committed to excellence. I say it again. Back a number of years ago, in fact, we're approaching 20 years ago now, a Journey to Excellence was designed by the North American Division as a document to sort of guide the best practices in Adventist education. And it talked about 4 aspects: the purpose, the plan, the practice, and the product. This was used as kind of the background to look at the Adventist worldview document. So we come back to here's the purpose, the plan, the practice, and the product in that same structure as we had just a minute ago about the Adventist world being the Adventist worldview, having the fall and the redemption and those pieces around. And in fact, if you put them together, you'd see it like this. The creation, number 1, kind of goes back to the purpose. The fall kind of goes to the plan for how we're going to deal with it. The practice has to do with redemption, what is God's way of helping us. And the recreation comes back to the final product, us restored in the image of God. And I could go to this, and just like there is, I don't know if there's a pointer on this. Is there a pointer on this? Yeah, there is. Just like purpose is here, and you see the purpose here, you'll see there's actually one of these drawn for plan and for practice and for product. I'm not going to go through those this morning because I'm recognizing the time, and we're just about ended. To restore in man the image of his Maker, to bring him back to the perfection at which he was created, to promote the development of body, mind, and soul, that the divine purpose of his creation might be realized. This was to be the work of redemption. Does that sound like the work of home? Does it sound like the work of the school? Does it sound like the work of the church? This is the object of education, the great object of life. So, what is at the core of Adventist curriculum? The cross. It better be. And if it ever gets lost sight of, woe on us. Odie mentioned my kids. This was actually a couple years ago. But in there are all 6 of my grandkids, all grown up by 2 years, like I said. About a year and a half ago, my son lives in Ohio, our middle son, has the 2 girls, and the one on the upper left and the one on the upper right. They were living in a home that had ended up costing them a little more. They were a little bit upside down in it because of the downturn in the economy. And they were struggling because they knew we wanted, and they really did want, their kids to be in Adventist education. And Spring Valley, my daughter-in-law had been a graduate of Spring Valley Academy there just outside of Dayton. And they were struggling with financially to know how to keep those kids in school. And they came up with a plan. They said, God, if you will help us sell the home so we can avoid all the realtor fees, we'll look for a smaller home that we can afford a little more, and then we should be able to have money to put our kids into the school. So they fixed up their house a little bit, and they privately put it on the market. Had a Facebook page. I can't remember all the things they used. They for sale by owner, the whole thing. And this was at a time when the economy wasn't really good, because this would have been just about a year ago. It had stabilized, but it hadn't turned around. And so they put it up to see what would happen. They were excited because there were some people who came and looked at it. They could tell they really wanted the house. They came back a second time. They really wanted the house. Nothing. So eventually, time goes on. These people finally came back. And in the process, somebody had suggested they were asking too much for the house. And my son turns to his wife and says to Ann, I think we need to lower the price because this is above even. They had a realtor friend that was like a family friend to his wife. And he said, your price is too high by about $10,000 or $15,000. And so Jeff turned to Ann and said, Ann, what do you think? And Ann said, we prayed and said, God, if this is your will, you will make this house sell. We're not lowering the price. Okay. They came back and bought the house at the price they had asked, which was above the market. They wanted the house that bad. Hallelujah. But then they needed to find a house to live in. So they moved in with her folks that lived there in the community for 4 months, which was, two families on top of each other. There's always the stresses. They knew there would be, but it was 4 months they lived in that situation. And they started looking for houses. And their friend, who also understood quick sales on houses that had been foreclosed on and sheriff's auctions and some of these kinds of insider kind of things, guided them. And eventually they found a house that they could not go inside. It's the thing about a sheriff auction. You can't go inside it. All you can do is walk around the outside. You can peek in the windows, but you never get to see inside. They knew the power had been turned off to this house for 2 years. It had gone through 2 winters. They knew the water had been turned off, but they didn't know when the water had been turned off. They knew it had a pool out back. The pool was properly filled. If you don't leave them filled, they would collapse because of the groundwater pressure. So, day came for the auction. The realtor friend went with Ann, and this was after bidding on several others and being turned down. They went into the bid. The bank was there, and Ann was there with her friend. Only 2 people. The bank bid their amount that they had to get for the house. They turned to Ann. Ann offered $100 more. The bank said, it's yours. They instantly had a house that gave them, according to the tax assessed value, $75,000 worth of equity, just like that. Of course, they had to pay for it within 30 days in cash. They couldn't, they had to have the money there. So they had to arrange for a really quick mortgage and all this kind of stuff and all through the thing. Anyway, they got into the house. So then it's time to turn the power on and turn the water on. And they had a plumber and an electrician present when they turned it on to make sure that there wouldn't be any disasters. Nothing leaked. No breaks in electrical. And they breathed this huge sigh of relief. My prayer is that they will remain true to their commitment. And I have to be honest with you, when some people, when they write stuff on Facebook, they bare their souls and say everything. And there are times when I'm scared to death to read my kids and their wives' posts on Facebook. I'm saying, Lord, what are they thinking? But I just hope that they'll remain true to that. I guess my question comes down to a basic question in closing. What are we doing to take our children with us? Where do we really realize the significance of what it means in completely taking our children with us? When you look at the Jewish culture, everything's centered around the family. Our culture is not that way. How do we make up that difference to put our kids so that they're not the ones that are sacrificed by the convenient decisions we make? One last slide. Can we say we're going to take our children with us? Closing hymn, number 653, I think. It may not be a familiar song to